When I was working in the manuscript room of the British Library, I often coincided with Douglas Chambers. And I was working on my biography, and he was working on Evelyn's letter books. These, co-edited with David Galbraith, were published in 2014 in Toronto. Preparing this talk, I learned of Douglas's recent death, following a long period of bad health. And I'd just like to add that note, because I remember him very fondly for scholarly generosity and congenial company. And to the topic. In late 1651, John Evelyn wrote to his wife's uncle from Paris. He was ready to return to England. I shall therefore bring over with me no ambitions at all to be a statesman or meddle with the unlucky interests of kingdoms. A friend, a book, and a garden should be, for the future, shall for the future perfectly circumscribe my utmost designs. As planned, he was back in England in early 1652. He never left again. As he put it, quotes, he'd run about the world, mostly out of my own country near 10 years. Remember the picture that I've got up here, because I'm going to refer to it again. This is Wootton, where he was born in Surrey, amongst the Surrey hills and in the woods. And it is the sort of, it's the wallpaper to his life, I suppose, but he hardly lived there. I'll meet it again later. When he ran about as best he could in the difficult times of the 1640s. And this is one of his own etchings. His etchings are, they're very, very valiant. They're not utterly successful. This is the best, I think. And if you look hard to the left, you will see his friend, Thomas Henshaw, sort of rising out of the rock. You can see a hat if you look hard. And Henshaw was one of several people from that era in his life, which was his sort of intellectual testing ground, I suppose, with whom he stayed in touch for the rest of his life, or nearly to the end of his life, mostly through the Royal Society. Back home again in 1647, I'm sorry, not back home again yet. In 1647, he'd married the 12-year-old Mary Brown in Paris, where her father, Richard Brown, who was created a baronet in 1649, was still representing the royalist cause. Now, in 1652, she was of age, and together they settled at Sayes Court, her family's house since the late 16th century, but desperately run down. This is quite a tricky map to discern, but down here, whoops, am I getting a little green light? Should be showing you a little hand, I'll walk to it, little hand-drawn picture of Sayes Court, the hand being Evelyn's, and various annotations about it. And that's really the only image we have of Sayes Court, apart from his idealized views of gardens, which aren't the topic of this talk, I'm sorry to say. He was such a busy man, he's very hard to capture. Mary, although actually English, she was altogether French by upbringing, and her husband, who was strongly Francophile, found themselves pitched into the unknown. They were living discreetly up against the walls of the dockyard. You can see the docks coming down there. But of course, it was in Commonwealth hands. It was not a comfortable place to be. Mary Evelyn's first child, Richard, was born that August, and her mother was there to help her settle into this new and testing life. Hardly 6 weeks after her grandson's birth, Lady Brown caught a scarlet fever and was buried at St. Nicholas in Deptford. In Paris, her husband was left disconsolate, that was Evelyn's term, while her death was felt deeply by the fluctuating expatriate community in Paris that knew her house, their house, the Browns' house, quotes, not only as a hospital, but the asylum to all our persecuted and afflicted countrymen during her 11 years' residence there. And that's a quote from Evelyn's diary. On the eve of his 32nd birthday that year, Evelyn made his will. The poor condition of the sequestered house, to which he soon gained a lease, the desolate gardens, and unfavourable setting downwind of the City of London, thus in the path of the, quotes, hellish and dismal, it's better with two L's, cloud of sea coal as it blew east, made the couple's marital home remarkably unattractive. They couldn't even glimpse the river. Yet in improving the immediate setting and fabric of Sayes Court, starting with a French-style oval garden to replace the existing rude orchard, Evelyn was helping his father-in-law endure what became a cruel, long exile. He was abroad for 20 years. He had enormous affection for Browne, and they shared many enthusiasms, above all gardening. Their letters are a delight, letters between the two of them, which are in the British Library, and which I use quite a lot of in my biography. His father-in-law's unremunerated service to the Crown haunted Evelyn and weighed down the already uncertain family finances. Wootton, which I showed you as the first picture, his treasured Surrey birthplace, was in his brother's hands. The family gunpowder mills, now given to brass and wire smelting, metalwork at least. Living 30 miles away, he could only visit and advise on planting. On every front, he waited patiently for change, since what else could he do, quotes, in this mad and estranged country, but busy himself building, planting, buying, felling, etc., as he wrote to Browne in 1657. In person, John Evelyn may have lived overlooking a working stretch of the Thames, but his mind was in France. He was thinking about its architecture and gardening, the manners and elegance of the Parisians, the beauty of the Seine, and the clarity of the air. Comparing Paris and London, he unfailingly favoured Paris. The Commonwealth, having made the English the most miserable of slaves, again a quote from him, was set against an active and illustrious monarchy, which was that of the young King Louis XIV. His first original work in 1652 was titled The State of France, but he toiled on, varying between translations and ambitious projects on many topics, while the garden took shape, and money, as Mary, who was to prove at least his equal, was to observe. The garden took over, gave him status, and it grew outside the windows and on the page as he toiled on with his massive Elysium Britannicum project. This was one of the several grand schemes, encyclopedic schemes, which he never completed and was never printed until very recently. More children were born, not many survived. But in 1658, their glorious boy, the first son, Richard, died. They entered a tunnel of intense shared misery. Never underestimate the death of a child, even at times when so many died. And the tone of Evelyn's writing darkened and on occasion sharpened. The Character of England, published in 1659, purported to be a translation of observations by an appalled French visitor on arriving in the country. Sorry, that's too fast. Going back. This was an outright attack, and he soon removed it from his list of publications, perhaps because it was a rehearsal of material used elsewhere, perhaps to the very word. There. He laid into the capital as a wooden, northern, inartificial, it's a strange word, congestion of houses, with narrow, irregular streets and walled-off fountains. There was no order, no care to make them build with uniformity. Only the portico of St. Paul's Cathedral and the banqueting house, both by Inigo Jones, escaped his censure. Evelyn unleashed a tirade. London was, quotes again, a very ugly town, pestered with hackney coaches and insolent carmen, shops and taverns, noise, and such a cloud of sea coal, as if there be a resemblance of hell upon earth. It is in this volcano in a foggy day, this pestilent smoke which corrodes the very iron and spoils all the movables, leaving a soot on all things that it lights, and so fatally seizing on the lungs of the inhabitants that the cough and the consumption spare no man. Evelyn used a mere pamphlet, Fumifugium, on your screen, 1661, to muster his arguments for the immediate attention of the reinstated monarch, and, better still, Parliament, now assembled, as he put it. Only vivid language could evoke the deadly predicament of the capital. He divided his pamphlet, into 3 sections. The 2 latter parts, in particular, offered solutions dealing with the essentials of public health, urban planning, and strategies for improvement. And as it was, London was unfit to be the imperial seat of our incomparable monarch. And he signalled Fumifugium as not all. His dedication refers to another larger work in progress, which, quotes, "I am preparing to present to your majesty, as God shall afford me leisure to finish it." Evelyn was naive and not well attuned to court manners, let alone the monarch. Quotes, "A man who will rise at court must begin by creeping on all fours," as Lord Halifax the Trimmer put it. But for an instant, the king seemed to have engaged with the topic and the author. His interest in Fumifugium and its topics, discussed over a mass breakfast and then a rather select dinner on the royal yacht as it raced from Greenwich to Gravesend and back, allowed Evelyn to entertain the highest of hopes. He was dreaming of royal patronage for himself, but also for his wife, who almost began to get close to a position within the court. It never happened. But above all, his wife's father and the great aim, which was to settle Sir Richard's enormous debts, which were in the hands of the Crown. By his standards, by Evelyn's standards, this is, the message and the measures proposed in these pages are clear and to the point, tailored to Charles II's notoriously brief attention span. Evelyn believed he'd caught his interest on the Thames that day, quotes, "commanding me to prepare a bill, being resolved to have something done in it," as he noted exultantly in the diary entry for 1st of October 61. Evelyn remembered that promise of action. The king did not, for an instant. Sylva, the larger work he mentions, began life as a presentation to the Royal Society, of which Evelyn was a very early fellow, in October 1662. The handsome book published in 1664 was the first to appear under the imprimatur of the Royal Society. Evelyn included contributions from many fellows and correspondents. Over time, it grew considerably, but remained steadfastly practical, surveying and discussing trees in all their species, variety, and uses, and taking many of the earliest statements of the first edition and expanding on them in the end, in numerous different editions. But the capital was not dependent on wood for fuel. London's tortuous relationship with supplies of sea coal from Newcastle on Tyne mirrors our own troubled relationship with oil, hinging on supply, cost, and taxation. Scarcity and high prices presaged political volatility. During the winter of 1643 and 1604, royalists supporting Newcastle would not ship coal to parliamentarian London. The embargo cleared the atmosphere, that was physically, but manufacturing was on its knees, and artisans and the urban poor were always the losers in these ructions. The parallel with lockdown London in spring 2020 are also inescapable. When the uppity Dutch sailed up the Medway in June 1667, the coal fleet, which turned out to constitute a third of all English merchants' shipping, was as vulnerable as its naval counterparts. Evelyn believed that domestic coal was hardly responsible for pollution since, quotes, culinary fires were weak and less often fed below. His outrage was directed at noxious trades such as brewers, dyers, soap and salt boilers, lime burners and the like, which were, without exception, he thought, in the wrong place. There had been attempts at zoning, such as the removal of some urban breweries, and a bill in 1657 which ordered brick and lime kilns to be located 5 or 6 miles outside the city. This is Holler looking east. You can see London Bridge. And it is an interesting observation that I just reached as I was making a selection of images, that you hardly see cloud, you hardly see this smoke. And of course it gives huge focus to Evelyn's language. Evelyn was confident that there would be enough to deal with the problem Evelyn was confident that the problem could be dealt with once the sources of the offending smoke, which he enjoyed comparing to, quotes, Mount Etna, the court of Vulcan, Stromboli, or the suburbs of hell, were diverted well beyond royal, partially royal at least, Greenwich, somewhere probably out around Woolwich. It has been argued that Evelyn's smoke in Fumifugium is figurative. On that reading, cleansing the smoke-filled corridors of Whitehall marked the end of the Commonwealth and the reinstatement of the monarchy. But his animated, angry text is surely one of urgently required strategy rather than royalist metaphor. Hence its numerous reprints and continual applicability. Rather, as William Cavett writes, it can be seen, quotes, as a restoration attempt to re-establish order through innovation and transformation. How ironic that London, vulnerable, filthy, and unhealthy as it was when Evelyn wrote his fierce little tract, was turned to smouldering rubble by flame rather than fiery words. In Fumifugium, Evelyn recommends the relocation of industry, the control of city expansion, and the greening of the surroundings, all of which talk to our own concerns. The regular town, encircled by thick plantings of trees and fragrant shrubs, was a prototype green belt. It was for delight, to help feed the people there, and to replenish stocks for the essential woodlands that would form part of it. The emphasis on beauty, the emphasis on utility, underscored with beauty and thereby scent and orderliness, is echoed by John Claudius Loudon's hints for breathing spaces for the metropolis of 1829. Also by Octavia Hill's campaigns for greater park spaces, especially to the east of London, and of course that led to the founding of the National Trust. And in Ebenezer Howard's Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform, published in 1898, quickly reissued as Garden Cities of Tomorrow in 1902. I'm sorry, This is the unruly city, and that is Ebenezer Howard. Sorry, I'm caught out by that one. So Ebenezer Howard's programmatic approach, which became, of course, the Garden City of Letchworth, the first Garden City, rather less so the second Garden City at Welwyn Garden City, is demarcated according to function, and that is a diagram from his publication. It's in both publications, but this is the a further worked up one. And you can see on the outer edge, group of slumless, smokeless cities. Slumless, smokeless cities was really exactly what Evelyn was arguing for. And within the different sectors, you have an astonishing variety of both industrial activities, social homes for waifs, homes for inebriates, epileptic farms, large farms, and more, college for the blind. Nothing is forgotten, both in social, industrial, and of course, within those little roundels, of course, people are living. The pink round in the center his population 58,000. Anyway, that's Ebenezer Howard's version. The control of urban growth by designated open space drove Greenbelt legislation in the mid-20th century. Evelyn's long and benevolent shadow falls over all of these. On publication, he pressed his trifle, which is, I'm still talking about Fumifugium here, on close associates and influential friends, such as the leading scientist, Robert Boyle. The subtitle quotes, "The inconvenience of the air and smoke of London dissipated," was followed by, quotes, "some remedies humbly proposed." 20 years later, tellingly, he misremembered that subtitle. Writing to Dr. Robert Plott, Fellow of the Royal Society and Keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, he called it Fumifugium, or a prophetic invective against the air and smoke of London with its remedies. His humble proposals had turned to prophetic invective, surely forged out of frustration. In 1688, he assured his good friend Samuel Pepys that he had sent, quotes, "the old smoky pamphlet you desired, which, had it taken effect, might have saved the burning of a great city." They were discussing relevant laws, but Evelyn couldn't remember any statutes that had been applied to London. After the 1666 fire, the message in Fumifugium was restated and refined for a third time in his unpublished Londinium Redivivum, apologies for the Latin, which accompanied his plan for the City of London, which was highly diagrammatic, bore a lot of resemblance to the plan of Christopher Wren, and in a sense was the illustration to the text he was writing, which of course wasn't published, so it sat alone. He wrote that a cleared site for a new city would allow for the recycling of, quotes, "useless and cumbersome rubbish, maybe even the building of a new quay with waste material." Recycling, you see. He suggests, inverted commas, necessary evils, slaughterhouses, fishermongers, and the same old lot, brewers, bakers, dyers, and soap makers, be moved out, perhaps to a waterside at Bow or Wandsworth, or beyond city boundaries in Islington or Spitalfields. Reused brick could be used for paving, while waste pipes should be immured in plaster of Paris for cleanliness. Evelyn's planned London was perhaps informed by his role, taken in 1662, as one of 21 distinguished commissioners for London streets, although the commission itself had been overtaken by events. In 1664, so this is of course before plague and fire, Evelyn was swept into a prestigious and purposeful official role as one of the 4 commissioners for the sick and wounded and prisoners of war, a role in public service which required efficiency and action. It played to different and active strengths in Evelyn's character and experience, and led to his major involvement in the establishment of both Chelsea and Greenwich hospitals over the coming decades. At home in the garden, atmospheric pollution was finding optimum conditions in a succession of harsh winters, and none was worse than 1683-4. Evelyn's precious Sayes Court was laid waste. Over London, and he writes, "The excessive coldness of the air, hindering the ascent of the smoke, was so filled with the fuliginous steam of the sea coal that hardly could one cross the street, he says, sorry. And of course what he's actually describing is a sort of a lid which has come into play so that the pollution is pressed down by another layer. And of course under this is this ferocious cold. He described the fate of his garden in a letter to the Royal Society, which was published in full in the Philosophical Transactions, which was the magazine of the Royal Society. And he offered advice about tending injured plants, very much as if they were sick patients, very much as if they were the sick seamen who he'd been responsible for earlier, if that's not a little exaggerated. But his account ended with the poignant discovery of his tortoise, self-buried as usual for winter hibernation, but now dead. So this is the official portrait of Evelyn by Kneller, which was commissioned by the Royal Society and is in their possession still, and dates from the late 1670s. And what does he have in his hand? Well, of course, he has Sylva. And just to clarify, Sylva is usually published, was usually published with the title written as YLVA, but for some unaccountable reason, the edition of 1706, which was the year of his death and the one on which he was still working, is SILVA. Perhaps he didn't have time to talk to the publishers before everything was, the die was cast. So that's it. And interestingly, that's an early rendering of Evelyn. It's after a print by Nonte, well, it's after wonderful drawings which are still owned by members of the Evelyn family and which I reproduced in my book. And those drawings are both John Evelyn, Mary Evelyn, and also his parents-in-law. However, this has sort of been slightly coarsened in the telling, and I think it's rather touching somehow that the very young Evelyn is captured on the frontispiece of Sylva, published in 1706, at which point he was 86 years old, but still writing. The subsequent history of Fumifugium is telling. In 1772, the Reverend Samuel Pegg the Elder, an obscure antiquarian, reissued it, possibly prompted by a major financial crisis that year. Downturns tend to favour radical ideas and fresh starts. It had been Evelyn's misfortune to success, Pegg says, to suggest, quotes, a work of such consequence to so negligent and dissipated a patron, and that is, of course, Charles II. And the Reverend Pegg further pointed to the enormous growth of industry in the intervening period, coal-fired, centrally located, and he even includes what he describes as the fire engines of the waterworks, which were perhaps even more dangerous in their pollution than useful in supplying water. The terrible evidence of bills of mortality for infants and children also pointed to the real toll, which was from atrocious air quality. Again, it seemed Evelyn's still timely ideas might help to mitigate the horror. But as the decades passed, the situation merely worsened. William Upcott's edition of Evelyn's miscellaneous writings, which was in 1825, brought him back to attention. And this is the period in which people, in general, became aware of Evelyn's work again, and an edition, Bray's edition of the diaries, were added to that. And the diaries, I should perhaps just say as an addenda, are very rarely are they immediate comments. They're very, in general, and there's a wonderful scholarly edition, and De Beer, who did this edition, has traced the sources for all sorts of things that he wove into the words and the pages of his diaries. So it's a little bit misleading to think of them as diaries, and of course they always lack the brio and the fine, wonderful etching, you could say, of Pepys's diaries. They are a very, very different kind of document. But just occasionally he comes jumping out. And that moment when his father-in-law is left in Paris when his wife has died out of the blue is one such. There are quite a few moments in the early days. Latterly, he does tend to expand on the sermon that he heard the week before, and you can lose him. And I'm losing you. So as the decades passed, the situation continued to worsen. That's the pollution. But with Upcott's edition, The monthly review noticed that Fumifugium's emphasis on the purification of the London atmosphere, as well as the great panacea for the purpose, was planting. And perhaps that prompted Loudon's diagram for urban growth bound by what he called breathing spaces, which was surely a leaf out of Evelyn's book, as were his very important proposals for garden cemeteries to be beyond city boundaries. The 1706 edition of Sylva, this one, proposed a mile-long gated single burial ground to the north of the city, and in its text also reminded readers of the author's Fumifugium, lest they had forgot. There's a little asterisk and it's in the margin. And a lot of the language and the statements are very close to the ones from the 1660s, or 1661, I should say, in particular. And soon after that, Wren was, in fact, promoting ideas for extramural burial grounds with great energy to the commissioners. And this is thought to be the very first such in London, which is St George's Gardens in Holborn or Bloomsbury, whichever you want. And it still has, with its surrounding walls, which are thought to have been possibly modelled on something that Hawksmoor drew up. This is the space, the kind of space that was being suggested. And of course, it was well outside London when it was laid out. So this idea of the burial of huge numbers of people, obviously at the plague, but with waves of infection and so on, it was incredibly important that these locations should be secured. And that's a very interesting example. And of course, plays to the current need for small open spaces as we are confined closer and closer to home. And they are what Octavia Hill, who herself had a great interest in John Evelyn, what she termed outdoor sitting rooms. In the 1680s, the statistician Sir William Petty, who was another fellow of the Royal Society, had painted a hellish vision of the exponential view of the growth of the capital, leading to a continual series of plagues. Calculating that the population would be nearly 11 million by 1840, little exaggerated, Petty guessed that only some 200,000 would live elsewhere. Evelyn's admiration for Petty knew few bounds. "If I were a prince," he wrote, "I should make him my second counsellor at least. There's nothing difficult to him. There's nothing impenetrable to him." Many things were difficult for Evelyn, and many things were impenetrable, and much of what he wrote is impenetrable. So how ironic it is that Evelyn's writings have so outlasted Petty's. In 1930, Fumifugium re-emerged into print to support the case against the siting of Chelsea, that is Lots Road, power station on the Thames. Here at last you see smoke on the in an image, this was by Donald Maxwell, and it just shows perhaps the imagined level of pollution that those tall chimneys were going to bring into play. And it's quite ironic, really, looking at that, because one of the sort of medium palliatives to the 17th century pollution was to just build chimneys higher so that you could lift the whole thing. Well, actually, what goes up comes down. Not such a great idea. Fumifugium received a thoughtful review in its 1930 re-emergence in Nature, I think not the same magazine, by someone initialed RR. At intervals, more editions followed under the aegis of the National Society for Clean Air, which was itself the successor to the Coal Smoke Abatement Society. Too many words in these. Which was founded in 1898 by the painter Sir William Blake Richmond. And I think that's interesting that it was a kind of visual notion that drove, or it was a painter and people whose who were offended. It's not a doctor, it's not a scientist, it's a painter who thought that coal smoke was such a blight. The Clean Air Act was not passed until 1956, and there was another in 1968 following the great smog of 1952, and that led to the deaths of 12,000 people. This is actually a slightly earlier smog, and it's the Palace of Westminster. I think probably it was most days like that during the winter, during that decade after the war, and probably well before it as well. In a further twist, it was found that lack of light and direct sun led to rickets in children, so it was another different health hazard. The impact of what was known as dark smoke was profound, and its effects quite as real as the swirling smoke that Evelyn had described in the corridors of Whitehall. I think not metaphor, but reality. Evelyn was 80 when his birthplace, Wootton, became his last home by rights. That's very early, that's a drawing by him, and I think it gives a very good impression of the kind of terrain, because and to this day it's nestled, it's in the Surrey Hills, the landscape is highly protected now, glad to say, and all around the wonderful, wonderful woods. And certainly the last time I was in the area, I noticed that a number of the beech trees had little sort of necklaces on, and they all said property of the Evelyn family, which I rather like. Anyway, at this point, the woods were a source of income, and of course, because there was business there, and these two buildings in the foreground are mills which were being used for some kind of processing, charcoal was of the essence. And so, although Evelyn always described himself as born of the woods, or words to that effect, his family were also, they were eating away at the woods. So it was quite a delicate balancing act. In 1703, a massive hurricane wreaked havoc on the standing timber that his forebears had planted and begun to cut down recently to meet their debts. But as usual, he dealt with the disaster by writing. He added valuable new and old material to Sylva, and wrote Memoirs for My Grandson, which was written in 1704, but not in fact published until Geoffrey Keynes published it as a non-such press edition in 1926. Geoffrey Keynes was a great admirer of Evelyn's writings, and he also published Acetaria, which is the discourse of salads, and designed, as Evelyn put it, for people who had a herby diet. So it comes to modern views of diet as well. Nothing was untouched here. Memoirs for My Grandson covered every conceivable topic, indoors and out, from securing the safe to clearing the gutters, but always with strict economy in mind. Evelyn's family jewels were in his head, in his library, and in the grounds beyond the windows. And he pressed young John, who soon became Sir John, as the heir of an unentailed estate, to consider, quotes, the timely and most continual planting of woods and timber to which the soil is so inclined. In old age, Evelyn had become ever more alert to enlightened, conservation-minded management of woodland, shamed by his family's careless exploitation of timber for industrial charcoal along the fast-running Tillingbourne Valley, which was, I think it's about 12 miles long, and it was absolutely full of industrial enterprises, mills of every sort. It's very hard to imagine when you go to the wonderful countryside around Wootton and Albury, and there was a kind of industrial revolution going on there in the 17th century and afterwards. Fortunately, Evelyn's grandson was everything that he could have wished. In his care of Wootton, his modest demeanour, and his life of the mind, he became a Fellow of the Royal Society and added a new library to the house. He died in 1763, aged 81, so he got the genes as well. John Evelyn's encyclopedic tendencies and prolix style worked against his zeal to be a reformer, let alone an intellectual powerhouse. But two books, the brief Fumifugium and the ever-expanding Sylva, had endearing and purposeful afterlives. On the 400th anniversary of his birth, on October the 31st, they are undoubtedly his most effective memorial. And we must share Evelyn's burning sense of urgency. Yet, like the feckless King Charles II, our leaders don't bother to keep their promises, even when they make them. Surrounded now by mostly unseen but deadly hazards, we're reaping the whirlwind. Surprisingly enough, Evelyn's voice is entirely of the moment.
Gillian, thank you very much for a really interesting lecture. We do have a few questions, if that's all right. One of them refers to, one of the first ones that was posed refers to the library that you referenced at the end of the lecture. The questioner says, in 1977-78, John Evelyn's library was sold and dispersed. Do you know how much was lost, what remains to be discovered? Do you have a view on the library?
I have a view, as I think probably an absolute majority view of anybody who looked in that direction, was that it was the most terrible thing to have done. What drove it, I don't know. I mean, the family was not on its absolute uppers. But I think it was an encumbrance. And it was before, I mean, it predates the lottery. There's, I think, some money from the National Memorial, Heritage Memorial, whatever it was called in those days, came into play. But it was the most astonishing amount of I mean, the library went, but furniture went, and artifacts went, all sorts of, it kept on rolling. And it was a very, very open wound. When I first went to an event involving Evelyn, it was very raw still, and that was 30 years on, just about. So I don't know how many fine, let's imagine, I think he may have had a Robert Hooke's micrographia.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that was never identified, and I don't think that went into... I mean, the National Collections did everything they could. Evelyn's Cabinet of Curiosities went to the Jeffrey Museum, and I used to go and visit it once or twice, and then it disappeared, and I had a little discussion with the then director, and where's it gone? And of course the Museum of the Home, as it now is, wanted much more interaction, children, working with things and getting a sense of period by other means, and so it went off as an object in a study collection. Right. So you've got all these different sort of levels of there isn't an Evelyn house into which you could place these things. There's Wootton is a conference centre. Before that, it was a training centre for Surrey Fire Brigade, I think. It was precious little left there. But to look on the bright side, the manuscripts, and that was a separate event. I'm a little rusty on exactly how it went. The manuscripts, of course, went to the British Library.
Right.
And from that, the manuscripts didn't. They went to Christchurch, they went to Oxford, and then they went to the British Library. And when they were there, Francis Harris, who was in charge of the manuscripts room at the time, did the most glorious catalogue. They are wonderfully catalogued. And I was the beneficiary, it just sort of got to the end, I think, when I started, and I nervously asked Francis if she thought I was biting off more than I should. It's a fantastic collection, and it was entire. So it's a checkered story, really, but I suppose it could have happened much earlier and to much worse effect, and there are all sorts of sort of old wives' tales about. And William Outcott got a terribly bad press because he went to see a suggestible old lady at Wootton and charmed his way. Tellingly, he was an autograph hunter, so he liked letters, particularly liked the signatures at the end. And he sort of apparently wormed his way into her company and was quite light-fingered with some of the things he saw. But he also looked into, or was shown drawers which were lined with, manuscripts and letters from, John, as he was known in the family, Sylva, Evelyn's correspondence. So, what to do?
Thank you. I have a question about plague and pest houses. Did Evelyn write about these? It was thought beneficial to that smoke would ward off miasmic smells. So how did his view on the smoky environment link with these beliefs about smoking and burning of fires?
Well, that's not really anything. The beginning of Fumifugium is much about health, but it's really it's the rambliest bit, and he's threading all the different things through it. As a assiduous attender of Royal Society events and a reader of philosophical transactions, he would have known what the theories were. It's interesting that your questioner mentions miasmic, because I was having a conversation both at home and elsewhere as to when that term actually came into use. I don't think that Evelyn used it, but I might be wrong. If you realised how dense Evelyn's writing is,
sure.
I could easily have missed the use of miasma, but it's, of course, comes into its own much more so in the 19th century, and my line to miasma, in a way, is I wrote a biography of Octavia Hill, and her grandfather, Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith, was one of the Board of Health who were dealing with a huge, several cholera epidemics, crises, and they were still dealing in miasma theory. Miasma was it. It was all in the air. And it wasn't, of course, until the Dr. John Snow went to the water pump in Soho and it all came out of the water.
Yeah.
But the actual word, I've diverted really from the question, which was, could smoke? At one point he's very dismissive of the idea. Somebody suggests that you could send a boatload of peeled onions down the Thames, and they would disperse fumes and thus dispense with germs. And he thought that was a very silly idea. But of course, he was a long way from any kind of medical proficiency, and his own circle didn't really include any of the great medics of the day. It was much more, many more chemists and different kinds of scientists.
That leads on to this next question, actually, Good. About his role and reputation in the early years of the Royal Society. The questioner says that, according to the Fellows list, his profession is listed as virtuoso, and his field of interest researches are arboriculture and horticulture. What do you think about these labels?
Well, I know about his feelings about virtuoso, and I wonder if that came to haunt him, because, of course, when there were several extremely satirical plays put on, which poked merciless fun at the early fellows of the Royal Society, And Evelyn found himself portrayed at least once, I think more than once. And the word virtuoso came as a sort of stick to beat him with. So he was very, and of course, you know, it is a word that could be used, I mean, even now, you could sort of see how it could tip different ways. I think in the early days, you know, he was one, there were enormous numbers of thoughtful, busy men of the shires who were sending letters in and sending, I mean, if you look at the philosophic transactions, it's a sort of extraordinary sort of heaving, you know, it's a sort of beehive of observations and ideas and collected, I was going to say trivia, but not necessarily, which I suppose if you were someone like Boyle or Wren or any of the considerable figures, many of whom were the leaders in their individual fields, they would perhaps have had a bit of a chuckle. I think Evelyn was so busy accruing his knowledge. I mean, in some areas he just got terribly out of his depth. And of course his translation of Lucretius was the famous one, De Rerum Natura, which took up a lot of his time in the 1650s. I think that was, of course, pre-Royal Society. But he was listened to respectfully, as far as I know. He was a great arboriculturalist. He was a great horticulturalist. I mean, the limits of my topic meant that really Evelyn the gardener's been squeezed almost out of the picture. But I was thinking also in the matter of the death of the child and those years of the late 50s, the garden was, I mean, clearly was his therapy. I mean, he was indulging in something which he loved to do. And the same, in fact, when, you know, they first arrived at Sayes Court and he was trying to keep his father-in-law's spirits up. So that gardening was, I mean, it wasn't just a sort of, he wasn't cataloguing, he was using the growth and the habits of nature and his observations on a much wider sphere. And I think that's, again, has a very sort of contemporary ring as we look to, you know, just the beneficial elements of a green landscape in hard times. So it's, you know, the actual horticulturalist, arboriculturalist, you know, he was a damn good etcher, but he only did, you know, there's only two little suites. He didn't have time, or, you know, he probably had inclination, but he didn't have time for that. So there were many, many things that he touched on and didn't take any further. But I think that's fine, but I don't think he would have been happy with virtuoso remaining on the page.
One of our audience members is wondering, was Paris really so much more pleasant environmentally than London at the time? Napoleon III, of course, much later, was inspired by the UK to introduce large parks. Was Paris not using coal?
I think it was. I did intend to have a very good look at where industrial activity occurred in Paris, and my memory is that it was much further out. And I mean, that's a rather interesting observation when you think of Paris and London today, because Paris has always kept its office content in a completely separate box from where people live and where the cultural life goes on and so on. And I suspect that because, of course, you had, you know, a king who was being very absolutist, and Paris was, you know, a mirror of Le Roi Soleil. So it was everything that he could possibly show, and I'm sure it had a modicum of pollution, but you know, it was domestic and not industrial. And of course, you know, the Seine has many sort of well, at a huge length, and I think people live much more, had a much more kind of utilitarian view of the river, beautiful as it was, as it, because it goes underneath, it sort of cuts through the escarpment outside Paris, so it's a landscape feature, but it's also, it's a working, it was the working river in the way that I think the whole sort of setting of the Thames was so execrable by all accounts, the actual approaches. And it's interesting, that comment about making a quay so that people would get to the river, because even that was difficult, dirty, muddy steps and just filth. So I think because Paris was there it was the showcase, it was the shell for that monarch. And that was physical and literal as opposed to metaphorical.
Interesting. Last one. Would you say that Evelyn's care for the environment was mainly based on his love for gardening and the beauty of nature, or did he believe in the intrinsic value of the environment? It's kind of putting a modern spin on what his priorities were, but
well, I think the latter, in the sense of everything being so interconnected, and that's what, as I was sort of going through his writings with this slant, as opposed to other reasons that I've read his writings, it does. Even Sylva, in its fullest form, of course, it is section by section, different kinds of trees and so on, but it's extraordinarily diverse, and everything sort of scrolls out of that. And of course, I shouldn't overlook the fact that he considered himself to be a very spiritual man, and that idea of the wider environment was, it's God's earth. And we might not find that, tallies with the idea of environmental consciousness, objecting to the root of HS2. It doesn't come across as a spiritual issue, but let's just go back
yes.
At least 300 years. And I think that's, I think he saw the interconnectedness of it all, and as I was saying before, the idea of the emotional succor that a good landscape or fine planting, or even this really by all accounts, the garden they made at Sayes Court, of which there really is no image except this very idealized and very misleading plan, which I decided not to show because we don't really know how much of that ever occurred. People came, people visited, the king came, it was a very, very highly acclaimed piece of mostly French horticulture brought to these shores, and it was very, very unpromising, and it was an extraordinary achievement. So, he could magic. He knew how to sort of magic something out of almost nothing in that case, whereas his home at Wootton was already just the most blessed spot, and he just you can see the elements of kind of a bit of Italianate garden that he did to sort of, I think his brother kind of gave him these little sort of, not so little, tasks, make our garden a bit more like Albury, which was the grand one down the road. And the Italianate thing was, if you can't go to Italy, then make it in your backyard if you can. And that's, of course, so Italianate. So there's memory, and there's uplift, and there's a connection, as I say, between just lots of different aspects of how man goes through his life, here or then.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being so generous and answering so many questions, and for a wonderful lecture. And thanks to our audience for attending. I would like to alert you to some upcoming lectures. On Monday, the 2nd of November at 1 p.m., Murray Pittock, Professor Pittock, will be speaking about Bonnie Prince Charlie. On Tuesday, the 3rd of November at 6 p.m., our Professor of the Environment, Jackie McGlade, will be talking about connected nature. And on Wednesday, the 4th of November, our Provost, Simon Thurley, will be continuing his series with a talk on Ruling Passions, the Architecture of the Cecils. So please do join us for what promises to be a really interesting week. Thanks very much.